If you're familiar with the Bible, you're familiar with the story about the healing of the centurion servant. And it shows up in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. We refer to the whole thing of the healing of the centurion servant, but really the healing of the servant in itself isn't really the central focus of that account when we read it in both Gospels. So what is it that we're supposed to pick up from a passage like that? And what was it about the centurion's faith that made Jesus marvel? We might think of things from an opposite or inverse perspective, where we would marvel at Jesus and the things that he does, and we certainly do that, and people back in his day certainly did that. But it's interesting because we come upon a passage of Scripture. It says that Jesus marveled at what the centurion had said. So why is it? What was it about the centurion? What was it about what he said or did or whatever that made Jesus marvel? We're going to talk about that, and I think there's some good things in store for us. So I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right. Well, I hope that just coming into this and just disclosing to you what we're going to be talking about today, I hope that that's piqued your interest, just so we can get to the bottom of what's going on here in this passage regarding Jesus and this Roman centurion. We're going to draw mostly from Matthew chapter 8. There's a parallel passage in Luke chapter 7, and there are some differences between the passages in Matthew and Luke. So we will kind of note those differences and see how we can navigate through the story just by those differences. Before we get into the text, before we get into our time in the Word, again, shameless plug time, letting you know again about the availability of my book, Signs of the End, a book that talks about Jesus' Olivet Discourse in Mark chapter 13, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. You can also get it on Kindle as well. So that is also an option that is available. Also, I wanted to let you know that I appeared again on another podcast. Last week I told you that I'd been on Babylon Singularity. It was interviewed on that podcast where I had a conversation about my book. I was on another podcast, but this one was not related to my book at all. It's a totally different thing. For those of you who've listened for a while, if you remember, probably about a month or two back, I'd say, probably more a couple months back, just letting you in on sort of the spiritual crisis that I had hit up on, and just kind of things that I'd been going through spiritually that were really excruciating and oppressive, and how people from the Twitter world really just came and surrounded me in my time of need and joined me in entering into the prayer room, the throne room, and in prayer to God. And so this podcast that I was on, by the way, it's called Wonders in the Deep, hosted by Matt Borja. We kind of talked about that. His podcast is kind of geared towards, talking about the things about navigating through our struggles, our sufferings, and things like that, and God's work in our lives in the midst of those, and things like that. And so I was invited on his podcast to talk about that, because he's familiar with that. He was one of the people on Twitter that reached out to me, one of the many people that reached out to me. So that's how we got connected. So I was able to be on his podcast. Matt Borja is a really great guy, a true gentleman, and I enjoyed conversing with him. Let me just provide you with a little bit of a sample from that podcast.
And so even further, even extended from that, and just kind of thinking about what God is possibly doing, here's the thing, as far as it relates to my church. I am, and just so you know, at my church, I'm not the main teaching pastor there. another one of the pastors is one who does most of the preaching. I preach occasionally, but starting like a couple of months ago, I started my own series that I'm going to be preaching on a consistent basis on the second Sunday of each month, and the whole thing is surrounded around community and fellowship and what that looks like scripturally, and what that's going to look like for us as a church is something that I've been very passionate about. So it's very interesting with everything that happened with me going through what I did, going to Twitter, seeing the community there, and just bearing myself out there, which is outside of my comfort zone as it relates to that. Wow. And so the realization that God's, just started to speak to me, and this was a week before it's my time to preach that month, to continue on in that series. And so, in trying to shore up all the preparation and stuff with the text that I'm looking at, as I started considering the text and the sermon and everything like that, I'm thinking, I can't go with the normal flow, at least for this month. Yeah. Because in the course of what I want our church to realize and hopefully gain from our study of Scripture and what God has for us as a church, I want people to understand that as a community we need one another. And so I'm thinking, if I go into this next Sunday, just, I can lay out a very nice expositional sermon. I can say, the Greek word here means this, and this is what it means for us, and put together a well laid out sermon, but still keep all of that stuff inside of me and confess, hey, God, this is where I am and I need you. Yeah. That would, to me, I just saw that as me being one of the biggest hypocrites. Sure. And I said, I can't do that. So I scrapped the plans for that. I eventually got back to it the month after that. But for that particular second Sunday, when it was my time to preach, I kind of changed the script, and it wasn't easy, but I think that's where God was leading me. He kind of gave me a gentle nudge in the back and saying, okay, if this is what you're aiming for, this is your passion for the church that you help pastor, it starts with you. Absolutely. So you're going to have to go out there and you're going to have to be vulnerable with your people there. Wow. And it's just like, oh, gosh, okay.
You want to be effective, here you go.
Yeah. And so it was very informal, so informal to the fact that I confessed in the middle of it and said, look, I don't even know how I'm going to land this plane here. I don't have a well-crafted conclusion and everything like that. I'm just up here and just speaking to you guys. I'm telling you what happened last week, where I was at, what happened with everything with Twitter. This is something that goes back to my seminary days 18 plus years ago. And I want to tell you guys, I need you. Yeah. I need you. I need your prayers. I am one of your pastors, but I am not invincible. Yeah. Neither is Mark. Neither is Jeremy. Those are the other two pastors. And I need you. And that's one element in this entire context of what we should realize, and I hope that we pay as we continue in this monthly series, is that we need one another. Okay. Yeah. And so in order to foster that community and just kind of getting a little bit on a deeper level as a community, I realized I needed to be true with everybody else with where I am and expressing, hey, this is where I am right now, and I need you guys, and I need your prayers. And to describe, this is what I need prayer for, it requires me explaining everything that I've been struggling with for these many years.
So check out that episode and give it a full listen. Again, the podcast is Wonders in the Deep, hosted by Matt Borja. You can access that episode on his website, mattborja.com. Also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I believe Stitcher as well, some of the areas, some of the places that you can access his show, his podcast, and also that episode in particular. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that it's profitable for you. Okay, so the Roman centurion. It's very interesting. One observation that one can make when reading through the New Testament, and you have some sort of mention of a centurion. A lot of the times, pretty much, I guess you can say all the time, that a centurion is mentioned, he's mentioned in a very positive light. Even though from a Jewish Israelite perspective, if you're looking at in the first century a nation that rules over you, and a lot of times oppressively, you don't have any sort of positive thought about anybody in that group or that class of people. But in the Bible, there are many centurions, but in the Bible, whenever a centurion is mentioned, he's mentioned in a positive light. The one that we're going to look at here is one of them. There was a centurion at the crucifixion site when Jesus died, and he said, "Surely this is the Son of God." You remember him. And then there's Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, who was a God-fearing man, but needed to know the full gospel of Jesus Christ. Peter came and preached to him and his household, and he became saved. So you have instances there where you have a positive outlook on people like centurions. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that every centurion in the Roman world in the first century were good people. I'm sure that there were a lot of very bad centurions who were very evil and wicked. I'm pretty sure of that. But, it's just interesting that Scripture seems to, give us a look at good centurions who were really connected some way positively to the faith, or connected positively to Jesus Christ. And we're going to look at one of those people here. It's interesting. If in case you're not, this is your first time coming on to Loving the Scriptures, this is your first episode listening or whatever. In case you're not aware, we're in the middle of a break from a series of studies that we're doing in the Book of Revelation. We've taken a couple of weeks off thus far up to this point. We ended with chapter 12 a few weeks ago. Took a break the last couple of times. Still continuing on in that break this time, and we're going to pick up on Revelation later. But it's interesting whether you're just joining us now or whether you've been with us for a while. Maybe you've noticed something. Those of you who have been with us for a little bit, is the podcast episodes that are in this break have seemed to veer towards the whole subject of faith. And that was something that I didn't even realize until I was in the midst of studying for this passage. And you're saying, like, I seem to be on a faith kick, where that seems to be the theme. And I guess maybe that's the way that God designed it and arranged it. I don't know. But it's just something that just hit me, and I just kind of realized that, and just kind of thinking along those lines. I think I want to continue with that this time, and at least I would say maybe one more episode. And going along with that. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman and her faith. That was a sermon. I featured a sermon that I preached, and that was that episode. And then last week we talked about James chapter 2 and talking about, explaining that whole passage where James says that people are justified by works. So what are we to make of that? Is he saying that it's faith plus works that gets you saved? And so the answer to that question obviously is no. And so we spent time explaining from the passage what James is actually trying to say, and that salvation is by faith alone. It's always been through faith alone, by grace through faith alone. But just explaining what works have to do with it, and how works are a demonstration of a true living faith. And so that's what we talked about there. So there was kind of a faith theme in that as well. And so coming into this time, and actually it was just kind of as I was thinking about this passage and bringing it to this time, I just realized, this is the third time, in this break that we're taking in Revelation that's connected to faith. It's just hit me at that moment. So this is totally by accident from my end. Maybe it's something, again, like I said, maybe it's something that the Lord has orchestrated for it to be that way. And so thinking about this, and also thinking about something else related to faith, I'm thinking, here's my thinking here as far as how we'll proceed. We'll probably do, obviously we'll look at this passage this time. I have one other thing in mind that I would want to talk about, or I guess maybe call it another New Testament example of a display of faith in Jesus' ministry that I might want to that we'll probably take a look at next time. So there's this time, and then there's next time, and then after that next time. So the episode after next, I think, is when we're going to pick up again on Revelation 13. Okay, so this time and next time we'll still be in that break, and then after that we will resume with Revelation chapter 13. Now buckle your seatbelt as it relates to Revelation 13. We're in for some good things, no doubt about it. But we're also in for some heavy duty things as well. And I think we know that. I think we understand that. But I just want to throw out that warning anyway. But we're gonna navigate through that chapter and that text in the best way that we can. Like I said, I don't know how long we're going to be in chapter 13. We might be slightly in that chapter, slightly longer than we usually are in any other given text or chapter, at least as it relates to how long we usually spend in chapters in the book of Revelation. So we'll see. We'll see how that unfolds and how that turns out. Whatever the case may be, and whatever ends up being unfolded in that, my prayer is that each time we go through a passage in that chapter, it'll be profitable, it'll provide clarity, and that you'll walk away with a greater appreciation and love for our Lord Jesus Christ. So that is the goal there. Okay. Enough of all of that. Let's go ahead and get into the text. I'm going to draw mostly from Matthew chapter 8, this whole story of the faith of the centurion. And so let me just read the account here. It's a short enough passage here in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. Okay, and this is what we have here. It says, when he had entered, and he, being Jesus, when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. While the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion Jesus said, Go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. Okay, so there's our account there. And so I guess let me just start out by just kind of covering a little bit of the difference here. One of the big differences that you see here between what I just read for you from the account in Matthew and what you see in Luke, in the parallel passages in Luke chapter 7, the big difference, and we won't read through Luke chapter 7, but the big difference here that's noticeable. Well, there's two noticeable things. One noticeable thing is who actually interacts with Jesus between these two accounts. Here in Matthew, the way it looks is that the centurion himself is interacting with Jesus face to face. In Luke, what we learn is that the centurion sent messengers, and the thing that you see here is these are Jewish messengers to Jesus to meet with Jesus, and the centurion's request is given to Jesus through these guys. Okay, so there isn't actually a face-to-face encounter between the centurion and Jesus, according to Luke. And then the same thing, going on when Jesus says, I'll go to his house and heal him. When the centurion learns this, he sends another group of people to meet him and say, hey, and they're relaying the centurion's message to Jesus and saying, hey, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, so forth and so on. So again, the one big difference is that in Matthew, what you seem to have is a face-to-face encounter with the centurion. With Luke, the way that Luke describes it, it's like the the interaction between the centurion and Jesus is indirect, and it's delivered through these messengers that the centurion sends to Jesus. Now, if you're a deeply rooted skeptic, I mean, this might be something where you would pounce on this and say, "Aha, the Bible is inaccurate. You can't trust it and everything." Look, and if you're looking at this and seeing the glaring differences between that, don't let that bother you, because really what you're dealing with is no different than just, whether it's through the agency of representatives or not. The truth of the matter is that the centurion's message to Jesus is the same. And so whatever the messengers are saying to Jesus, it's as if the centurion is saying it to Jesus himself. Okay? So it doesn't matter if it's direct or if it's through an intermediary. The message that's from the centurion to Jesus is the same. And it's so much to the point that Matthew doesn't concern himself with that detail. And so he can say that the centurion said to Jesus, da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, that's all. So whether it's direct or indirect, it doesn't matter. The words of the centurion reached Jesus, and that's really what's important here. So, and so when Matthew says that the centurion said to Jesus this, really that's true. It doesn't mean that it had to be a face-to-face encounter in order for it to be true and non-contradictory to what you see in Luke. So don't worry about that difference there. But the other difference that we have here between the two passages, another big difference, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, are the extra words, I guess you could say, that Matthew includes. At the end of here, where he talks about those coming from east and west, and then the sons of the kingdom and everything like that, that whole explanation is something that's in Matthew's account, but not so much in Luke's. And it's that later portion that we read about in Matthew that I really want to kind of hone in on a little bit when we get there, because I think it says something very interesting. And it kind of piggybacks off of a little bit of what we were talking about last time in James chapter 2, because the whole thing with James chapter 2 and the confusion that people have regarding that passage, is James advocating faith plus works and all those sorts of things. Remember the conclusion that we made as far as what James was actually saying in that passage. He's saying James was not advocating faith plus works in order to be saved, but he was saying that true, genuine, living faith is always demonstrated by works. And in a certain sort of way, we kind of see that principle laid out here and even expounded upon somewhat briefly by Jesus. Okay. And so that's what we want to see here. But even more so, we look at, if we get down to what is happening between the centurion and Jesus, again, the question that we might want to ask, and we'll get into this here, is that, what is it about this centurion's faith that made Jesus marvel? Because it said there, remember we just read it a couple of minutes ago, where it says there in verse, where is it here? Verse 10, where it says, "Truly I tell you, no one," at the beginning of verse 10, when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you," so forth and so on. Okay. So we're going to get to that, but let's just start out with the whole thing, with the basic thing of what we have going on here. In this text in Matthew, we have Jesus entering into Capernaum, and Capernaum was on the northern coastal, the seashore region of the Sea of Galilee, and it seemed to be Jesus' home base. Whenever there was a place to return, he usually returned to Capernaum. That's where Peter was from. Peter had a house there, and this is one of those times where he's coming into the city. And I guess you can just kind of consider it home base for Jesus and for his disciples. And so that's the setting that we see here. He's coming into Capernaum. Verse 5. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." Now, so there you get an idea of what's going on here. This isn't a healing for he himself, but for a servant, and for a servant that evidently he cares for, and one who is, as it says there, suffering terribly. So this isn't somebody who has some sort of minor aches and pains or anything like that. This is a serious episode of suffering on the part of this servant. Whatever the case is, I think you get the impression that this servant wasn't one who was paralyzed all his life. He really wouldn't be much as one who would serve as a servant if that was the case. He really wouldn't be able to do much. And there really weren't a lot of options back then for people who were paralyzed. Now, the Bible has laid forth the conditions of people who had been paralyzed their whole lives, and they were healed. And just given the fact that they've never known what it is to walk around and things like that, the healing is very magnificent, especially for them when they get to walk around for the first time. You don't get the sense of that. I mean, he's a servant. He's been going around serving this centurion, and this centurion. By the way, centurion is a Roman commander within the Roman army who commands over a regiment of 100 soldiers. Hence the word centurion. Century. We usually associate that with the number 100, right? So that's what that is. So this servant has been one who's been serving this centurion, and whether by some sort of accident or maybe some sort of ailment that results in paralysis down the road, where he's really sick and not able to get up, he's not able to walk or anything like that. Whatever the case is, it's a serious deal. It's a serious situation, and as it says there, that he's suffering terribly. Now, in verse 7, it's just a simple matter of he says, "Hey, this is the deal with my servant." No question that's really asked, "Hey, can you come and heal my servant?" But I think him coming to Jesus and telling him about his sick servant, it's implied what he's wanting. He's wanting him to heal the servant. And so in verse 7, it says, and he said to him, "I will come and heal him." Now, I just think about this for a second. And again, what we have here is we're dealing with something more than just an account of the healing of this centurion servant. Now, that is significant. Any healing is significant, and we're let in on the fact that the centurion servant is healed, and that is an amazing thing. But there's so much more that goes into this story, and namely, the whole thing of the faith of the centurion. And it's a simple, initial encounter here, whether you're talking about the centurion himself or the messengers who give the message to Jesus. They tell him the situation, and Jesus is like, "Great, I will come and I will heal him." There's no convincing that needs to go on here. So really, if there was a straightforward sort of outworking of this whole situation, you'd have these people come and say, "Hey, this my servant is sick." Jesus says, "I'll come and heal him." Jesus would come, he would heal the servant, leave, and then that would be that. Very straightforward sort of thing. And like I said, there's no additional convincing that needs to happen for Jesus to do this. I mean, it's already a lock. Jesus says, "I will do this." So we understand that, everything that the centurion is doing here in the verses to follow isn't in any way, at least you wouldn't think there isn't any sort of ulterior motive or something to try and get him to do A, B, C, or D. He already has what he's looking for. A positive response from Jesus where, Jesus says, I will heal the servant. Now, what Jesus says here, he says, "I will come and heal him." So Jesus says, "I will go to his house where this servant is, and I will heal him." And that's no different from what you see Jesus doing in other areas, in other situations, during his earthly ministry when he heals people. This isn't anything unusual. I guess the one thing that's individual is that the person who's making this request is a Gentile. Okay, now let me point out something to you, and I guess here's another difference between Luke's version of this and Matthew's version of this. And I will read this. Like I said, the parallel passage to this is in Luke chapter 7. And so the words that we're going to be exposed to here are the words of the messengers that the centurion sent himself. And I want to read this to you because I want to take these words and compare it to what the centurion later says to Jesus. Okay, so in chapter 7 of Luke, let me see verse. Actually, let me just start at the beginning here and just read through where I want to read here. So in chapter 7, verse 1, it says, "After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death." So there's another important detail there, is that and that gives you gives you an understanding of the seriousness of the situation here. So it's more than just paralysis; it's a sickness that has brought about this paralysis. But it's more than just paralysis; it's something that's leading towards death. And also, as it says here, who was highly valued by him. So this servant was highly valued by the centurion. Now, verse 3, when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews. So there's the messengers. So these are Jewish messengers here, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they being the Jewish elders, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, now listen to this, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." Okay, so you have these. So, and listen, though that message was an add-on from these Jewish messengers. That's not from the centurion himself. The centurion's message is, "Hey, can you come and heal my servant?" The servants add on to this in addition to the request and saying, "Look, this guy is worthy," and I want you to underline that in your mind. He is worthy to have you do this for him, because, as it says there, he loves the nation. He loves the nation and built the synagogue. I think one way of saying that is that he maybe donated a significant amount of funds so that the synagogue can be built, or allowed it to be built, whatever the case. But his hands was in the midst of the building of the synagogue. So it was a very Israel-friendly sort of thing that this guy had, this centurion. And because of that, and because of the kindness that he expressed towards the nation for the people of Israel, these Jewish messengers saying he is worthy to have you do this for him. Now, you take that and then you compare it to what the centurion says. So, Jesus is coming on his way to heal. And I guess since I'm here in Luke, I'll just continue on here with what happens next. Because in verse 6 of chapter 7, it says, "And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, 'Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof.'" Okay, that's verse 6. And the same thing, if you flip over back to chapter 8 of Matthew, he says he says the same thing. Verse 8 of chapter 8. "But the centurion replied, 'Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof.'" I'm not worthy. Okay, so here, according to Luke, you have these Jewish messengers saying he is worthy to have you do this. Now, the centurion doesn't mention any worth or unworthiness as it relates to Jesus, performing the miracle, but I think that you can, by extension, get an idea that he would see himself as unworthy of having this, this done for him, that he's humbly coming before the Lord and asking humbly that he would come and do this. But, his whole statement of him saying that he is unworthy to have him even come under his roof would give you an understanding that this guy probably has a different perspective than these other Jewish elders that we see in Luke, who says that he is worthy to have this done for him. The centurion would probably say, "No, I don't deserve even that. I am unworthy." Now, specifically, his unworthiness, or the expressed unworthiness from the centurion, is saying, I am not worthy to even have you come under my roof." Now, here's the thing. I've heard it said from people here and there, and even from commentators and everything, that this has a lot to do with the centurion's recognition and his understanding of, the ceremonial uncleanness that would come upon a Jew if a Jew entered into a Gentile's house. Now, listen, that is true. If a Jew entered into a Gentile's house, he would be ceremonially unclean. And in a lot of ways that, the Jews saw that as unlawful. That was Peter's whole hang up when it came to Cornelius. And when he entered his house, he says, that it's unlawful for me to even be here under your roof to do this. And so the connection is made by a lot of people is that when he's saying that I'm not even worthy to have you come under my roof, the whole idea is the centurion saying, hey, I don't want you to come under my roof because if you do that, I know that you'll that from the Jewish tradition and everything, that you'll be ceremonially unclean. I don't want you to go through that. Just stay outside, and that sort of thing. But I think we're missing the point here if we're interpreting the centurion's words to be that. Now I'm without a doubt. I think I'm pretty sure that he is aware of the unlawfulness of a Jew to come into a Gentile's house. I don't think he's unfamiliar with that. I think he is familiar with that. But even if that were the case, the centurion can still have Jesus come to the outside of his house, outside of his door perhaps, and maybe still being in close proximity, albeit on the outside of the building, perform his miracle, and then, send Jesus on his way. But that's not the impression that you get here. So I think that it's more than just, he recognizes that that a Jew can't come under the roof of a Gentile's house. I think we're dealing with something more than that. And you get a clue of that even more so when, just the way that he expresses this and what he says there. He says, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. This is what he's saying about himself. I am not worthy to have somebody as great as you come under my roof, which gives you this understanding that this man, and we'll get a sense of this even with what he continues to say. We'll get to that here in a minute. But this man has an understanding of who he's dealing with. And in great displays of faith, that's normally what you see. What you see cataloged in examples of people who display examples of great faith. One of the big things that you see in that is that you have somebody who has an understanding of who they're dealing with. Okay? And even if you notice here, twice in this passage, in verse 6, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed. And then in verse 8, but the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Now, the word Lord in the Greek, it could mean sir. It could just be a generic, polite term of meaning sir. Or it could mean Lord in the sense, that in a sense of when it's directed to Jesus, recognizing him as God, Lord as in Lord God. So, there's a possibility of two meanings there, but given what the centurion knows and how he directs this, well, not directs, but, how he addresses Jesus and his whole outlook on what Jesus is able to do, you get the sense, at least I do anyway, that the word Lord here is the centurion's recognition of who he's dealing with, and he's dealing with God himself. Okay? Now, maybe some part of that unworthiness is if it has anything to do with the Jew-Gentile sort of thing, maybe in some way it's connected to the centurion realizing and recognizing who God is, who Jesus is, and that he is God, but that because he is a Roman soldier and that he's part of a Roman government that is oppressing God's people, maybe that has something to do with it. If anything, I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. I'm just saying if there's any sort of connection between the Jew and Gentile thing, and which would cause the centurion to say, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, maybe that's it. But that's just speculation on my part. But really, on a grander scale, I think what we're dealing with here is that this centurion understands who he's dealing with, and he understands who he himself is in comparison to who Jesus is. And this, with that realization, he's one who says, I'm not even worthy to have you come under my roof. He's not comfortable with that. Now, listen, this is not to say, and I just wanted to establish this and lay this forth here, just so we have an understanding here. This isn't to say that anybody else in this situation, if they were to have allowed Jesus to come under their roof, Jew or Gentile, because whether you're Jew or Gentile, I mean, you're still talking about God underneath your roof, right? Anybody, Jew or Gentile, let's say Jew or Gentile, if anybody in this situation, if it were anybody else, and they allowed Jesus to come into their house, that's not to say that they would have done anything wrong by allowing Jesus to come into their house. It's not like this centurion had a right response, and anybody else who would have done oppositely would have been wrong. That's not what we're dealing with. We see Jesus going underneath roofs, going into people's houses to perform miracles and things like that. We wouldn't accuse those people of being less reverent toward Jesus Christ because they let him come under his roof. I don't think that that's what we're dealing with. We're just dealing with something that's personal to the centurion. So a personal stirring in his heart where he says, I don't know if I would even want you to come underneath my roof, because I know who you are. I know who I am compared to who you are, and I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. I mean, even if you think about somebody like Peter, who has had someone like Jesus underneath his roof, right? But after the miraculous catch of fish, where they caught so many fish that the nets began to break, he said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. Go away from me." He felt like he couldn't be in the presence of God at that moment, because he was floored by the magnificent display of God's power in his midst, and he had a very terrifying realization of who was in the boat with him. And in that, he had a clear understanding, at least at that moment, who he himself was compared to who Jesus Christ was. And so in a certain way, if you could add words onto what Peter was saying at that point, I guess you could say one of the things that he was saying in what he said was that I'm not even worthy to be in your presence right now. Get away from me, for I am a sinful man. Whereas you, I understand and I recognize that you're God, right? That's kind of what we're dealing with. So I think that is the issue that's going on in the centurion's heart. Now, it's interesting. Jesus doesn't fight the centurion on this or anything like that. He doesn't say, "Hey, look, it's okay. I can come in. It won't be a big deal." And a lot of what goes into that is, I think that, again, when you work your way over to what Jesus says, what said in verse 10 about Jesus marveling, because this is this is what the centurion goes on to say. Okay, so he says, "For I am not worthy to have you come under my roof." Now here's the continuation. "But only say the word, and my servant will be healed." Notice a certainty there. This wasn't any sort of guess. This wasn't any sort of theory that he had. It wasn't like, I think the way that it works is that you can just say something. You can just say words, and I think that'll be good enough, right? It wasn't really anything like that. This guy was certain. He knew how things worked with Jesus. He knew how things worked with God himself. He understood the power that Jesus had, being God, being provided with that power through the Holy Spirit to be able to work the miracles that he did. Okay? And so he says, I know that you can just say the word, and my servant will be healed. Now, there is an expression of faith right there. He says, I know all that it takes, and it doesn't require you to physically be there in order for you to do this for me. Now, he understands, he already knows that Jesus will do this for him. Jesus is on the way. He's en route. Okay, he's en route right now. And so the centurion stops him, but he says, look, I know and I understand that you're able to say a word. Just say the word, and I know that it'll happen. Now, what is it that allows him to think that way? Not only in the sense that he understands that Jesus is God, But connected to that, if we're dealing with God himself, he understands that God has authority. And that's what he gets into there. When he continues, he says that, just but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. Now notice the dual thing that you have there. The centurion is saying, I know you have authority, and I know how authority works because I'm one who is under authority, and I am one who has authority over other people. So he says, for I too am a man under authority. I mean, he has people that he has to answer to as well. I mean, the one person that he would ultimately, if you go up higher on the food chain there, that he would have to answer to is Caesar himself. You get high enough there, but he understands that he is under people, and so he has to be one who follows orders whenever orders are given to him. And he's one in that order, in that line of command, is one who has to obey. So he knows how to follow orders, but he also knows how to give orders as well. So this whole recognition of how authority works within his sphere of life gives him this understanding of how things work in the spiritual realm as well. And because he knows who he's dealing with, he says, I know that you have ultimate authority, and that when you exercise that authority, whatever you say, whatever you command to be done will be done. So this is a person who understands that Jesus has authority over sickness and disease. I think he understands that, and he understands that he has authority over all things. But in that particular case, in that particular moment there, I mean, also, the whole thing of having authority over sickness and disease. And so see, this is incredible. And one might ask, how did he get this information? How did he come to these conclusions? Listen, the centurion, I'm sure, has been around. This is not Jesus' first rodeo in Capernaum, I can tell you that. And so with a combination of what he's heard about Jesus, what he's heard about Jesus and some of the things that he's done, maybe heard some of the teachings of Jesus himself, a combination of things. But whatever that combination is, he comes to the understanding that he understands this is God. Okay? And God is not limited to doing the things that he does in just one or two particular situations. It's not like it has to be this or this in order for his power and his authority to be exercised. And so the centurion says, look, you don't even have to come to my roof. I understand. I know who you are, and you can just say the word. And I know that you have that level of authority to be able to do that. And listen, Jesus, I know how this works. I know how this works. I know how the authority thing works. And I know that you can do the same thing right now. And so basically what he's saying, it goes back to what he said before. He says, just say the word and my servant will be healed. How is it that he can say that the servant will be healed? Because he knows that Jesus has ultimate authority. And nobody can say no to that authority when that authority is exercised as it relates to, his power over sickness and disease. Jesus isn't like one of these fake faith healers that you see on TV that you've seen over the years, who they say that they heal somebody, and then with the healing there's like either a gradual getting better, quote unquote. I think some of that's even psychological, but even with what supposedly might look like it's gotten better, within a short amount of time, the person who was supposedly healed goes right back to where they were before, sometimes in an even worse condition. That's not authority, and more than it not being authority, I think it's fake. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus doesn't heal today and that God doesn't heal today. He certainly does, and he certainly can. I'm just talking about the fake charlatans that we're so used to seeing. And you know who I'm talking about when I talk about those sorts of things. But this centurion says, I know you have authority. And so when you say the word in power and in authority, I know that it'll be done. That's where the certainty can come in. And there you see, at least expressed verbally from his mouth, this whole thing that this man truly had wonderful tremendous faith. Okay. And remember, he is a Gentile, and here's where we get into the whole thing of verse 10 here, of verse 10, where it says, when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith." Now there we've encountered that whole thing of Jesus marveling. Remember, I said before, I think when it comes to marveling, we think it's the other way around. Humans marvel at Jesus and who he is and what he does and that sort of thing. And that is true. But isn't it interesting that you have Jesus who marvels at just at what's been told to him? When he heard this, it says that he marveled. Why did he marvel? Because of who Jesus himself was dealing with. And Jesus in that moment was dealing with a Gentile. And a Gentile who had that much faith, was something else. But it wasn't just a matter of this Gentile having an outstanding faith, but it was him having an outstanding faith in comparison to the people who should already have had that much outstanding faith, and they didn't. That's what you have there. So that's why you have in verse 10 where he says, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith." There's the whole thing there. Now, here's the thing, because with Israel and the Jewish people had all the advantage in the world, you would think. So that by the time Jesus comes on the scene, you have people who are aimed and ready to embrace Jesus Christ as their Messiah. Now listen, some people did. I'm not saying that nobody did. Certainly people within the Jewish community did. But what do we see largely from the Jewish community? We see rejection. Even when you had people who were following him around, large crowds of people who were following him around, it was a mixed bag of people. You didn't have it where everybody was following him because they recognized him as a true Messiah and they were ready to repent for the salvation of their sins. Again, some people, yes, but again, with large crowds following him, and apparently there was a crowd following him here because he's talking to the crowd as he's talking about the centurion. Just think about John chapter 6. The people who witnessed the miraculous multiplication of loaves and fish. And you have, even after all of that, and even with Jesus' encounter with that crowd in John chapter 6, all of them except the 12 walked away from him because they were so offended by him. Right? Now, again, even with as large of a crowd as that was, that's just a small sample when you're thinking about the whole nation. And right up there at the top, leading the way, were the scribes and the Pharisees and those sorts of people, right? And so in the course of Jesus' ministry up to this point, what is the level of faith that you see from the Jewish community here, or even throughout much of Jesus' ministry? It's pretty low, okay? And this is from a group, and the big barrier I think that you have is that you're dealing with a group of people who really think that they have a faith in God that is sufficient, just as long as it's accompanied by works of the law. Again, that goes into everything that we've talked about before with last time. But really, at the end of the day, what many of the people in Israel had at that time was just a said faith, and it wasn't a faith that was active or was demonstrated. Right here, the centurion has a demonstrated faith, and it's a demonstration of faith that far exceeds anything that you would see with anybody else within the nation of Israel. Now, again, like I said, you do the comparison between Jew and Gentile. The Jews had all the advantages in the world, and they should have been the first ones to embrace everything by faith. It kind of reminds you, and I just want to read to you here real quick just to give you an idea of the advantages that the Jews had. These were, in Romans chapter 9, and this is in the context of, Paul talking about the Jewish nation as a whole. I mean, who largely, again, not every single person, but who largely did not believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so in Romans chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, you have Paul talking here, and he says, I am speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience bears me witness in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. Why? For I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, the brothers being Jews who did not believe, right? My kinsmen according to the flesh. Verse 4, they are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. So you see the privileges and the advantages that the Israelite nation had. Kind of even goes along with what Paul says earlier on in that epistle in chapter 3, where he talks about the people of Israel receiving the very oracles of God. I mean, what a privilege. And the encounters that they as a people have had with God throughout all of history. And it says in verse 5, to them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all, blessed forever. Amen. So these are people who are in prime position to to enter into faith in a right way, just based on everything that had been given to them and the advantages that had been given to them, just as far as God revealing himself to them the way that he did and everything. But even from an Old Testament context, we see that there's a problem, right? And that goes into the whole thing of God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. But even with all of that, they were still given all the advantages, just as far as God revealing himself to them the way that he did. So you would think that a people like Israel would be in prime position to embrace Jesus by faith as their Messiah, and to not just have a said faith, which is a dead faith if it's not accompanied by works, but it would be a live faith that's demonstrated by works. And what do you see? What do you see throughout the Gospels and leading up to his crucifixion? You have people who have a dead faith, and it's evident by their lack of works. And I guess you could say, if we're saying it's culminated up to the crucifixion of Christ, an abundance of their wicked deeds. Really? I mean, that's what you have there. Now, again, not everybody within that Jewish community, because you did have some who believed, but they were a small remnant compared to the whole group there. But here you have the centurion here in the midst of Jesus' ministry, who is displaying such great faith. And Jesus is saying, you know what? You'd be hard pressed to find this kind of faith like this man has in Israel. That's why he marveled. He marveled because the faith that should be abundant within the people of Israel was not showing itself off, and it was showing himself off from a Gentile, somebody who shouldn't know better, but he does, right? That's what you're dealing with. And so because of that, Jesus lays forth in the following verses here. We'll just cap this off here and read the rest of this here. As a consequence, what you have is, if we're just dealing with an abundance of people who just have a said faith, which really is a dead faith, and you have people like the Gentiles who express not just a said faith, but it's a faith that's demonstrated by works and deeds and those sorts of things. You have a very interesting scenario here. So in verse 11, it says, I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Now, who are the people from east and west? Those are the Gentiles, right? Yeah, I tell you, many will come from east and west, the Gentiles, and recline at table with, listen to these, the list of these three stellar guys, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to recline at table in the kingdom of God, with these three men and with the Messiah himself. It would have been every Jew's dream. I mean, these people salivated over the kingdom of God. They looked forward to the kingdom of God. They looked forward to the coming of the Messiah. They did recognize that the Messiah was in their midst, but they were looking forward to that, and they saw that with the coming of the Messiah would immediately come the kingdom, and that there would be this kingdom feast, and that reclining at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would be the faithful Israelites. There would be unfaithful Israelites. Those would be the tax collectors, the prostitutes, and those sorts of people. They weren't welcome. So Gentiles and the scum of the earth within the Israelite community, in their mind, were people, who were excluded. But your faithful Israelite person who supposedly lived up to the law, they were the people who would be welcome. So imagine, because again, Jesus is talking to the people who followed him. It says there in verse 10, he says, and he said to those who followed him. So he's talking to a crowd here. How big or how small, we don't know, but I mean, he's talking to a group of people here. Not just the 12, but other people who followed him around. And so imagine this crowd and what they hear and how they receive this when Jesus says, I tell you, many will come from east and west, and they would understand that to be the Gentiles, and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Now, verse 12. While the sons of the kingdom, who are the sons of the kingdom? Those are the people that I described before. People who in the nation of Israel would consider the faithful Jews, the faithful Israelites. Those people who saw themselves as worthy of entering into the kingdom and being in the presence of the Messiah and of these patriarchs and partaking of and participating in the kingdom privileges and the kingdom banquet, when the kingdom comes. The sons of the kingdom, the people who thought that they were in the right spot. It says, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. Now notice that they'll be thrown out. It's not just a matter of, I just think it's interesting that the words are used here. The impression that you get as somebody who's thrown out is that they're cast out. And behind that is this thought that says you are not welcome. You're here, but you're not welcome. I cast you out of here. Get out. So imagine, to a typical Jew at that day, being told that the Messiah will say to the sons of the kingdom, you are not welcome in the kingdom. Get out. And while you have Gentiles here who are able to partake of the kingdom privileges that the Israelites who are now on the outside thought that they would be able to participate in. Gut-wrenching things that Jesus is saying right now. And totally unbelievable, and I'm pretty sure would be a shock to the people who hear this. They would say, you mean to tell me that the Gentiles would be welcome into the kingdom, but we would not be? Yes, that's what Jesus is saying. Now, listen, let me just make clear, this isn't in an absolute sense, okay? Not in an absolute sense. Jesus is not saying that all Gentiles will be welcome into the kingdom and that all Jews will be excluded from the kingdom. Because again, what are we dealing with here? What we are dealing with here is a matter of faith. It's all dependent on faith. So that much is true. We're not dealing with, somebody is welcome or not welcome based on their ethnicity. The whole thing is faith. And what Jesus saw at that moment in his ministry, not a lot of people in Israel had true saving faith. But this one Gentile here does. And that's reverse of what everybody else would think it would work. Because Israel, being God's people, should have been the first to have that kind of faith, but they didn't. But this Gentile, who everybody else saw as an outsider, as an outcast, as it relates to the kingdom, is the one who has this faith. And Jesus, really in an indirect way, is saying, this guy right here, this centurion, he's welcome in the kingdom. He is welcome. And many of you are not. And we get clues of this. It's interesting that this comes, or the way that this is arranged in the book of Matthew, this comes right after, the whole thing of the Sermon on the Mount. And especially in that last portion there, what you get here, not only are you dealing with things where Jesus is dealing with false things that a lot of the rabbis and people of old are saying, or say, you've heard that it was said this, but I tell you this. So it's not only a matter of people being taught wrong, but again, it goes to this whole thing of people thinking that they have a right to where they need to be as far as entering into the kingdom, and Jesus saying, think again. Because in chapter 7, so just one chapter before, and in verses 21 through 23, Remember, it says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think that we're talking about the whole thing of people expressing Lord, Lord. I think you can say that in a way that parallels a said faith. Let's just put those things in a parallel form here, because that's really ultimately, I think, what you have there. And they think that saying Lord, Lord is enough. And really, you can go to what Jesus says in Luke chapter 6. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but you don't do what I say? Here's a said faith, but there's no follow through with works. Deeds don't follow. That's a problem. So here in Matthew 7, it says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me. Get away. Get out. Thrown out. See what we're saying here? Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So these were, listen, workers of lawlessness. That doesn't sound like deeds that match a true living faith, right? Well, these people might think that they did all sorts of wonderful, wonderful things. They were actually people who lived lawlessly. And Jesus will say to them on that day, I never knew you. And so what you're dealing with there were people who had a said faith, Lord, Lord, but did not have deeds that accompanied it. Workers of lawlessness. That's what you have there. And so in a certain sense, I think that that's what's hinted at here when it's talking about, in large part, the people of Israel, and Jesus saying, I haven't seen a faith like this even in Israel. And so in applying the immediate context there to what we'd see in the future, he says that people from east and west, the Gentiles, going to recline at table in the kingdom of heaven with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, sons of the kingdom. They're going to be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And make no mistake, people, we're talking about eternity here. They are eternally cast out. There's no getting in. They're cast out, and they're cast out for good. Because there was a said faith for many of these people. And by said faith, you can probably say just, belief in God, belief in the goodness of his law, those sorts of things. Again, Lord, Lord. But there really wasn't any follow through. There wasn't a demonstration of faith. And so the way that we end here in verse 13 and to the centurion, Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. So what a wonderful, wonderful story. And so, again, there's part of it where you see that, yes, there was a healing that took place. But really at center stage here was the magnificent faith of this centurion. And Jesus marveled because that was a faith that was demonstrated and far exceeded anything that you would expect to see with the Israelite people. They should have been the first in line to have a faith like that, and they didn't. And so what was true for the Israelites is that they just had a said faith, and it wasn't accompanied by works. So I hope you see just kind of how this connects to what we talked about last time. This is the sort of thing that James was talking about. So we're not dealing with something that's, in James's case, as we talked about last time, that's just kind of, James is just going wild and just talking about his own thing, and we have to reel James in and correct him and everything. No, James had his head on straight, as we demonstrated last time. James knew what he was talking about. Hopefully we have some clarity of that. But now what we see here is kind of a demonstration from a gospel account, something that actually happened, something that's real, that we can add to our mental database, along with what we talked about last time and what James talked about and what we explored last time as it relates to Abraham and Rahab. Okay, so hopefully all of that solidifies in your mind, and that sort of thing. So that's what that kind of looks like. So next time, I'm thinking what we're going to do is, and as I mentioned before, we'll probably go and talk about another example of amazing faith. And then once we look at that, the episode after that, the week after that, we'll start to get back into Revelation and pick up in Revelation chapter 13. If you're just joining Loving the Scriptures and you haven't been with us for our Revelation study, you've missed out on a lot of good things. Doesn't mean that you can't pick up where we are in Revelation 13. I would encourage you to continue with us if you truly like this program. But whatever you decide to do, there's a wealth of previous episodes that you can go back and look and listen to in our study of the book of Revelation. So whatever you decide to do, I hope that God truly blesses you in that. So we will leave it there for now. Okay. If you enjoyed this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. Don't forget about my book, Signs of the End. You can get that on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Somebody let me know a few days ago that they had trouble finding my book, and I think they were looking on Amazon. I didn't try and look myself to see what was going on there, and I just provided them with a link on Twitter, and they were able to get in there just fine. But if you have trouble finding it, go to my Twitter page, and I have the link there on my Twitter page, at the top of my Twitter page. I actually have a tweet pinned on there that has the link to the Amazon page. So you can click on there. It'll take you to Amazon.com and you can order from there. Okay. So Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Remember, it's also available on Kindle if that's your thing. And also one more thing, be sure to check out Wonders in the Deep podcast with Matt Borja. And also the episode that I was on, and where we converse about my struggles and trials and what God has done in the midst of that. Okay, so leaving it there for now. I hope that this time was profitable for you. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time.